The F-22 sliced across the sky, its engines roaring over the crowd below. But no one noticed the old man standing quietly by the rear fence, a paper flag in his trembling hand, his sun-faded Phantom Squadron cap tilted low over one eye. To them, he was just another forgotten face, a shadow behind the lawn chairs and camera phones. But when the jet banked hard for its next pass, something changed. The left wing dipped low, sharp, intentional. And in that instant, Hal Benton saw it. Not just the maneuver, but the eyes of a young pilot behind the visor locked onto his. The crowd kept cheering, some confused, some silent. But only one man understood why the sky itself had just bowed. Harold Benton was 85 years old, but you wouldn't know it by how he carried himself. He wasn't tall, but he stood straight. Not fast, but he never asked for help. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set like granite, as if the decades between now and 1971 had never quite settled in his bones. Once long ago, Harold flew an F-4 Phantom over the jungles of Vietnam. He never called himself a hero. He never called himself anything, really. After the war, Harold didn't return to ticker tape parades or speeches in school gymnasiums. He returned to a different battlefield silence. He packed away his medals in an old footlocker and settled down in a one-story home near Caryville, Texas, surrounded by quiet pastures and the static hum of shortwave radios. That's what Harold did. He fixed things. Radios, mostly. Radios people said were long dead. He had a soft touch for tuning broken frequencies. Just not for talking. The war was never a subject to be discussed, not even with his wife, Martha. She had asked once early in their marriage about the photo in the frame by his nightstand, the one of a younger man with a crooked smile and a helmet slung low on his brow. Harold said nothing, and Martha never asked again. When she passed from cancer 10 years ago, Harold didn't cry at the funeral. He just folded the blanket from her hospice chair and placed it on the couch like she might return for it someday. His son Doug lived out of state, now Air Force, like his father, though more administrative than combat. They talked on birthdays, maybe on Christmas. Harold didn't blame him. The world had changed, and Harold didn't know what to say anymore. His only constant companion was Daisy, a gray-furred border collie who moved slower now, but never left his side. She'd curl up by the front door every night like she was guarding something sacred. Maybe she was. But every year without fail, Harold Benton made the same drive. 2 hours east through winding country roads and four-lane highways, all the way to Randolph Air Force Base near San Antonio. That's where they held the air show. Every year, same seat, same lot, same purpose. Not to be seen, not to talk, just to stand beneath the thunder of engines and feel something most people in the crowd would never understand. He didn't wear his uniform or bring old photos, just his faded Phantom Squadron cap and a small paper flag he folded carefully into his jacket pocket. It wasn't for show, it was for memory, for ghosts, for brothers in arms who never made it home and never got a salute. And Harold never went with anyone. That was the point. This part of his life, the part no one ever asked about, belonged to him alone. Until this year. Because this year the sky had other plans. Harold Benton's mornings never changed, not in 30 years. Before the sun broke the horizon, he was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in the same chair beneath the same humming fluorescent bulb. The house around him was still the kind of quiet that echoed. Daisy, his old border collie, would stir from her blanket in the corner and settle next to his feet, always close, always watchful. He didn't use a coffee maker. That was too modern for his taste. Instead, he boiled water in a dented metal kettle and poured it through a cloth filter the way he learned back in Nam, when hot coffee was the only comfort after a mission. The mug he used was chipped on the handle navy blue, with a faded Air Force insignia barely visible under the glaze. He didn't mind. He held it like something sacred. After coffee came the newspaper. Not today's edition, yesterday's. Harold always picked up the paper a day late from the corner store. It was a habit he couldn't explain. Maybe it was his way of keeping time at arm's length, one page behind the world. He'd scan the headlines without much interest. Politics, shootings, scandals, it all seemed like noise. But sometimes when an obituary mentioned a veteran, Harold would pause. He'd read every word, nodding silently as if paying respect in his own quiet way. And every morning after coffee and the paper, he'd place his old squadron cap on his head. The cap had been through jungle rains and desert heat. It had been soaked in sweat, buried in a footlocker for decades, and patched once with dental floss when the seam tore. It wasn't just a cap. It was a piece of memory stitched with threads of duty loss and survival. Harold would then walk to the back porch, coffee in hand, and look out at the open field behind his property. Sometimes the wind stirred the tall grass just right, and he could almost imagine the sound of propellers slicing through air, the voice of his old wingman in his headset. Hawkeye Jim. That's who haunted his mornings most. Jim wasn't his real name, James Lockhart from Nebraska, but no one called him that. Jim had eyes like a bird of prey. He could spot trouble before radar ever did. Saved their squadron more times than Harold could count. And then one mission he didn't make it back. They'd been ambushed. Tracers lit up the sky like fireflies. Jim's Phantom took the brunt of it. His last radio message wasn't panic or fear. It was calm. "Go, Hal. I'll keep him busy." And he did. For years, Harold carried that weight. The mission was a success, but at a cost that didn't show up in any briefing room. Jim never got a flag, never got a wingtip, just a name on a wall and silence. Every morning, Harold lifted his cap slightly to the sky just for a second. Not because anyone was watching, but because Hawkeye still was. By 7:15 that morning, Harold Benton was already behind the wheel of his rust-speckled '98 Ford Ranger engine, humming low as he merged onto the interstate. 2 hours of road stretched between him and Randolph Air Force Base, and he knew every curve by heart. The radio played softly, AM only, somewhere between a Hank Williams tune and a crackling weather report. Daisy lay in the passenger seat, her head resting on his coat. She wouldn't come inside the base, but she always rode with him. As they neared San Antonio, traffic thickened. SUVs with flag decals, minivans with kids pressing faces against the glass. A convoy of memoryless motion, most of them excited for jet engines and funnel cakes, not the history that kept the sky free. Harold didn't mind. He never came for the spectacle. He came to remember. He parked in Lot C, same spot as every year, under the shade of an old mesquite tree. It was farther than most were willing to walk, but Harold didn't care. The familiar ache in his knees greeted him as he stepped out and straightened his back. He grabbed his folding stool, his small flag, and tucked his Phantom cap firmly in place. By 8:30, he'd made his way to the far western fence line, Section 12 he called it. No signs marked it that way, but he had always claimed the space near the last auxiliary pole. It faced the runway at a slight angle, just enough to feel the thunder as planes roared past. Except this year something had changed. The spot was already taken. A large family had spread out over the entire area. Blankets, lawn chairs, collapsible tables stacked with snacks and juice boxes. A couple of coolers flanked their setup like barricades. Kids ran in circles, waving foam jet toys. One was live streaming with a phone on a selfie stick. The mother was filming with a ring light. It wasn't remembrance, it was a production. Harold paused, unsure whether to speak. He took a small step forward, trying to find a corner of shade at the fence line. That's when it happened. A teenage boy, maybe 15, spun around, chasing his younger brother, and slammed right into Harold's side, knocking his arm and nearly making him stumble. The teen didn't even look up. "Watch it, Grandpa," he muttered, his eyes glued to the screen in his hands. Harold said nothing. He didn't bark back. He didn't scold. He just steadied himself on the fence post, adjusted the brim of his cap, and looked out toward the empty sky. Around him, cameras clicked. Children shouted. Flags waved, not from reverence, but from plastic sticks handed out at the gate. He took a few slow steps back, giving the family their space. He found a small patch of grass where he could still see the runway, just barely. No one knew he'd once flown faster than any of the jets on display that day. To them, he was just another old man trying not to be in the way. Harold Benton had just settled onto his small canvas stool when he noticed someone approaching. Not a child, not a parent with a stroller, but a young man, mid-20s, dressed in jeans and a vintage-style bomber jacket. The kind you didn't buy off a rack, the kind you inherited. The young man hesitated for a second, as if unsure whether to interrupt. He was holding something in his hands, an old creased photograph, and his eyes kept flicking between it and Harold. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Is that a Phantom cap?" Harold looked up, surprised. Most people at these events wouldn't know a Phantom II from a paper kite. "It is," he said, simply adjusting the brim. The young man's face lit up with something between recognition and disbelief. He stepped closer, carefully holding out the photo, like it was made of glass. My grandfather was in Vietnam. Ground crew. Carl Dawson, he passed a few years ago. But before he died, he told me about a pilot he owed his life to. Said he got pinned down during a rocket attack at Tan Son Nhut in '71. That a phantom pilot turned around, came in low, and pulled a suicide dive to scatter the enemy just long enough for the medics to get him out. Harold's brow furrowed slightly the way it always did when the past tried to claw its way into the present. Carl Dawson, he murmured. Dawson? Red Toolbox liked Johnny Cash. The young man's eyes widened. That's him. That's exactly how he described himself. He talked about you for years. Said he never got your name. Just remembered your voice on the radio and the way your plane looked, silver nose, black tail stripes. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he took the photo. It was grainy and black and white. A group of young men stood beside an F-4 Phantom dust and heat warping the image around the edges. Harold could see his younger self near the center helmet under his arm's slight smirk, unaware the moment would live on in someone else's memories. I've been looking for you for almost 2 years, the young man said. Every forum, every vet registry, even old base logs. But then last week I posted in a Vietnam-era aviation group. A retired mechanic from Shepherd Air Base messaged me and said, "You're looking for Harold Benton. He still goes to Randolph every spring. Find the guy in the Phantom cap." Harold couldn't find the words. He looked at the photo again, then at the man standing before him. There was a resemblance, jawline, eyes, the same earnestness. "My name's Jason," the young man added. "And I'm not here alone." He glanced toward the sky. "My cousin's flying today. F-22 demo team. Lieutenant David Lawson. He knows about you. He read the after-action reports. He knows what you did for my grandfather." Harold blinked, stunned. Sir Jason said quietly, "He's not just flying a routine today. He's flying for someone." Somewhere in the distance, the speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the sky for the highlight of today's show, the United States Air Force F-22 Raptor demonstration." The crowd erupted in cheers. Children screamed, phones lifted, lenses zoomed. But Harold Benton barely heard any of it. He was still holding the photograph Jason had given him, still staring at the faces of young men he hadn't seen in over 50 years. The heat of the Texas sun pressed against his skin, but what made his hand tremble wasn't the weather, it was memory. Jason stood beside him, now watching the sky. "He's flying for you," he said again, more like a promise than a statement. "David's read everything he could about your unit, especially the mission at Tan Son Nhut. He says what you did saved dozens, but no one ever wrote you up for it." Harold didn't respond. He just looked up, and then he saw it. Far in the distance, a sharp glint against the sun, then the scream of twin engines roaring to life. The F-22 emerged from behind the crowd, slicing through the air like a blade forged in thunder. It climbed fast, impossibly fast, then leveled off in a high-speed pass over the field. To the untrained eye, it was just another maneuver. But to Harold, who'd once flown at Mach 2 over a jungle hell, it was a language only pilots understood. And something in the jet's approach felt personal. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant David Lawson's hands gripped the controls with white-knuckled precision. The HUD displayed his speed trajectory and coordinates. But his mind wasn't on the instruments, it was on a single patch of grass at the west end of the viewing area. Section 12. That's where Jason had told him Hal would be. David had spent the last 2 months tracking down the full story of Harold Benton. He'd cross-checked flight logs, debriefing survivor accounts. And when he realized the man was still alive, still attending this air show each year, something inside him stirred. And now he had a decision to make. He'd rehearsed today's flight sequence dozens of times. Every maneuver had been signed off by the demo team, approved by brass, filed with the FAA. Any deviation could mean suspension, possibly grounding. But Harold Benton hadn't followed orders when he'd banked into enemy fire to save a pinned-down crew in 1971. So why should David? He tapped his comm. "Control, this is Falcon 1. Beginning second pass. Roger, Falcon 1. Maintain standard demo pattern." But David's path was already changing. The F-22 turned wide, pulling into a controlled arc that curved deliberately toward the western fence line. The crowd watched with awe, none the wiser. But Jason saw it first. "He's coming this way," he said, heart racing. Harold squinted as the jet dropped elevation low, tight and intentional. The roar grew louder until the metal of the fence began to vibrate under his hand. Then at the exact moment the jet passed directly above them, the left wing dipped. Not a flick or a correction. A full, deep, precise salute. Nose slightly down. Wing tilted low. Held for exactly 3 seconds. Harold's hand clutched the flag in his grip. It fluttered violently in the blast of air trailing behind the jet. His knees weakened, not from age, but from something deeper, something sacred. For the first time in his life, someone had saluted him. Not the uniform, not the idea of service, but him. Harold Benton, a gesture in the language only pilots speak. A message carved across the sky, written not in words but in flight. The jet soared back into the blue engines trailing fire, as the world below slowly remembered how to breathe. Jason didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Harold wiped at his eyes, looked down at the trembling flag in his palm, and whispered, "He saw me." For a moment there was only silence, the kind that doesn't come from absence of sound, but from something far deeper. Reverence, realization. The crowd that had moments earlier been roaring with applause now stood frozen. Phones lowered. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People turned one by one toward the far end of the fence line, unsure of what they'd just witnessed, but certain it meant something more than a stunt. The F-22 had saluted someone, and now every eye tried to trace its path backward. A teenage boy, the same one who had bumped into Harold earlier, and muttered, "Watch it," Grandpa stood slack-jawed. His phone still dangled in his hand, the screen showing a half-recorded video of the moment. But he wasn't filming anymore. He was staring at the old man with the faded phantom cap who stood still as stone flag shaking in his grasp. A few feet away, a Vietnam veteran in a denim vest slowly removed his own cap and held it to his chest. He didn't ask questions. He just knew. A young mother who had been live streaming the event for her social media account gently lowered her phone. Her daughter, maybe 7 years old, tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, who's that man?" The mother didn't answer right away. She knelt beside her daughter, wrapped her arms around her, and just whispered, "Someone we owe." The little girl raised her hand in a small wave toward Harold, instinctive and sincere. And then Jason stepped forward. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. "He flew with my grandfather," he said, voice clear and proud. "Saved his life in Vietnam." That's who the jet saluted. That was all it took. The words passed through the crowd like a ripple across water. More heads turned. More faces softened. The father who had claimed Harold's usual spot now stood with his arms around his children, watching quietly. The folding chairs, the juice boxes, the Instagram moments, they all faded into the background. Because now the story was changing. Now they weren't just watching jets. They were standing in the presence of something real. Living history. A man who had once answered a call the rest of the world had forgotten. The teenage boy swallowed hard, then took a step forward. He looked at Harold, not through him, not past him, but at him for the first time. "Sir," he said, voice shaking, I didn't know." Harold nodded gently, his expression unreadable, but kind. The boy reached up, hesitated for a breath, then brought his hand to his brow in a clumsy but heartfelt salute. And one by one, others followed. A slow, solemn wave of recognition and respect began moving through the crowd. Not orchestrated, not rehearsed, just real. Because they all knew now they hadn't just seen a maneuver in the sky. They had witnessed an overdue tribute paid in silence, with a wingtip and a roar to a man who had never asked to be remembered, but finally was. By nightfall, the clip had circled the globe. It started with a shaky phone recording, just 20 seconds long, posted by a teenager who hadn't even known who Harold Benton was a few hours earlier. The video showed the F-22's low pass, the sharp dip of the wing, and the old man in the phantom cap holding a trembling paper flag as the jet soared over him. Within an hour, it was on veteran forums. By morning, it had reached national news. The hashtags were everywhere. The wing dip. Forgotten. No more. Salute to Hal. Comments poured in by the thousands, many from veterans, others from people who had never served, but felt something stir in their chest when they watched the clip. I watched this with tears in my eyes. My dad was a phantom crew chief in Vietnam. Thank you, Mr. Benton. I don't know who needs to hear this, but this man deserves every salute we've got. That pilot knew exactly what he was doing. That wasn't a stunt. That was honor. By the end of the week, Harold's mailbox overflowed. Cards, letters, photos, some addressed simply to the Phantom pilot, Texas, USA, and they still found him. Strangers thanked him. Children drew crayon pictures of jets and flags. One letter came from the widow of a soldier Harold had flown with her. Words were short, but they cracked something open in his chest. He always said you were the reason he came home. I never got to thank you. So thank you. Harold read every letter, slowly, silently, sometimes twice. He kept them in a shoebox under the table next to his radio tools. Then came the official envelope, the seal of the United States Air Force embossed on heavy paper, an invitation from the commandant of the officer training school at Randolph Air Force Base. They wanted him to speak at the upcoming graduation. Just a few minutes, just a few words. At first, Harold considered declining. He wasn't a public speaker. He wasn't sure he even remembered how to be in a room full of uniforms. But Daisy looked up at him from the corner of the room with those calm eyes of hers, as if she already knew what he'd decide. So Harold pressed his old suit, the one he hadn't worn since his wife's funeral. He dusted off his cap. He folded a fresh flag. And when he stood on that stage before over 800 soon-to-be officers, he didn't talk about glory. He didn't talk about medals or air maneuvers or adrenaline. He talked about Hawkeye Jim. He talked about the ones who didn't make it back. He told them that courage wasn't always loud, that sometimes it sounded like a pilot whispering, "Go, I've got you," into a radio before disappearing into enemy fire. And when he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, not for a speech, but for a man who had never asked to be honored, and finally was. Harold Benton never sought fame. Not after Vietnam, not after the wingtip, and not after the graduation speech that moved nearly 1,000 cadets to their feet. He returned to his quiet home on the outskirts of Kerrville, where the land rolled gently into distant hills, and the hum of cicadas filled the evenings. The radio bench in his garage remained cluttered. The porch swing still creaked in the wind, and Daisy, slowing now, just like her master, rested at his feet every afternoon. But something had changed. The silence that once surrounded Harold like armor was now interrupted gently, respectfully, by knock after knock at the front door. The first visit came a week after the air show. A young cadet not older than 20 stood nervously at the steps, holding a folded piece of paper and a pie from the bakery in town. He didn't say much, just thanked Harold for his service and asked if he could sit with him for a little while. Harold didn't speak much that day, but he poured 2 coffees and they sat on the porch watching the sky turn from blue to gold. It became a tradition. Every month, a new cadet or young officer would show up, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs. None of them asked for photos. None of them brought microphones or media. They came to listen, to learn, to sit with a man who had done something most of them could only imagine, not just in war, but in the years after. To live with dignity in the quiet, to carry memories without ever demanding recognition. Hal never told the same story twice. He didn't need to. The cadets understood that some lessons weren't in the words, but in the pauses, the silences between memories, and the way he looked toward the horizon, as if it still held something he hadn't quite said. Then one morning he found it. On the porch railing, carefully placed beside his coffee mug, a model F-4 Phantom II. Hand-painted in perfect detail, down to the black tail stripes he once flew with. It was mounted on a small wooden stand with a note tucked underneath. He read it 3 times. "Thank you for clearing my skies. Lieutenant Vasquez, USA. Fana." Hal ran his fingers along the smooth metal wings, then looked up. The sky was clear blue as polished glass. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The years passed quietly. Daisy eventually left him buried under the old pecan tree out back, and the porch visits became less frequent. But the letters still came. From pilots, from sons of mechanics, from granddaughters of men he'd flown with. Some just said thank you. Others asked for advice. One cadet even sent him her silver wings after graduation, "Because I wouldn't have earned these without you, sir." Harold never replied to all of them, but he read every word. And every year on the anniversary of that wing dip, he'd drive again to Randolph Air Force Base. Section 12. Same stool, same cap, same flag. Only now people recognized him. Not in a loud way, not with microphones or flashing cameras, just a quiet nod from a passing officer, a subtle salute from a young pilot walking by, and sometimes a folded flag left on the fence with nothing written but his name. Some salutes come from the sky, others from the heart. Both mean I see you. In a world that moves faster than ever, where attention spans shrink and history fades into background noise, sometimes it takes the quiet tilt of a jet wing to remind us what honor really looks like. Harold Benton didn't need fame medals or headlines. What he needed was to be seen. And isn't that what we all want to be remembered? To matter. To know that when we're gone, someone will still look up and say, I see you. This story isn't just about one veteran. It's about all the silent heroes among us, those who served, who sacrificed, who held the line, and never asked for applause. It's also about the power of one gesture, one moment, to change how we see the people standing right beside us. So let me ask you, who's the Harold Benton in your life? Was it your father, a neighbor? Maybe someone you pass at church or at the grocery store who still wears that cap but never says a word? Tell us in the comments. Who do you think deserves a wingtip? And if this story moved you even a little, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest people often carry the loudest histories. Because sometimes the greatest salutes aren't loud, they're silent, and they come from the heart. Thank you for watching. Until next time, take care of one another, and don't forget to look for the quiet heroes among us. We'll see you in the next story.